Hello! Today we're going to work on testing some different types of flour. I have some pastry flour, all-purpose flour, and two types of bread flour. I'm going to take 100 grams of the flour and add 70 grams of water. That will make the dough 70% hydration. If you have some flour and you're not sure of the quality, then this little test will help you to decide whether the flour is good enough to use for baking bread or not. So come on, let's test this flour. Pastry flour has around 8.5 to 9% protein. The more bread flour that I like to use has about 12% protein. The gold medal all-purpose flour has about 10% protein. And the gold medal bread flour has around 13% protein. And protein is the gluten that's in the flour. The gliadin and the glutenine will hydrate and then they bond to create the gluten network. Let's get started with the pastry flour. In each one of these bowls I have 100 grams of flour already weighed out, and in each one of these cups I have 70 grams of water. I'll do these two really quickly first. The pastry flour is used for types of baked goods where you don't want a lot of toughness, like for instance pastries. And pastry flour is often also used for cakes and muffins and brownies and that type of thing. Okay, let me set that one aside. That's the pastry flour. This is the more bread flour. This is the bread flour that I like to use the most. And artisan bread flour very often is a little bit lower in protein than some of the other types of high gluten flour. Like for instance, you might have a pizza flour or bagel flour or other types of flour that are higher in protein, like maybe 14 or 16%. But an artisan bread very often has a lower protein amount because a slightly lower amount helps you to get the more open breadcrumb. This one's a little harder to incorporate the water into because it's got more protein and I can feel little tough bits in there, so I'm kind of mixing it a little bit more. It will also appear drier in the bowl than the pastry flour. I don't want to mix it too much and develop the gluten. This bread flour is 13% protein, so it's probably going to even be a little bit more difficult to incorporate the water here. And this dough will be a little bit stiffer because protein absorbs the water. The lower the protein, the less water is absorbed. The higher the protein, the more water is absorbed. So you have a drier dough, the higher the protein. And also, of course, if you have whole grains, they will also absorb more water. And that's one thing you can do if you have a lower protein bread and you find the dough is really slack and it just spreads too much, then put in less water. If you want it to act a little bit more like a bread flour and have the gluten bond a little tighter, then put in a little less water. Experiment with it. So we've got one more bowl to do, and that is our gold medal all-purpose flour. Now, all-purpose flours are very often a mixture of the higher protein flours and the lower protein flour. Now this dough's already stickier. You can see the difference in handling this one and handling the bread flours. Okay, so I happen to know the protein levels of these flours, but you can purchase flour with unknown protein content, or the protein might not be a high-quality protein. This simple test can help you decide whether your flour is suitable for making bread with. I used 100 grams of flour and 70 grams of water in each one of these bowls, but you could easily cut the amounts in half and use 50 grams of flour and 35 grams of water, and you'll have enough to help you test your flour and see what kind of quality it is. I just used the larger amount so that it was easier on camera to pull the window panes, but you could easily do it with half the amount. Okay, now I'm not going to pull a window pane on these right away because it's been several minutes for me to mix the pastry flour all the way to the last all-purpose flour here. And the first few are already doing their gluten bonding. So if you want to test it right away, like this one, we just mixed it. If you want to test your gluten right away, right after you mix it, just pick it up and try to pull it and see what kind of a window pane you get. And you can see here that we're not getting much of a window pane. We're not getting any window pane at all. Okay, so real sticky dough means it most likely has a lower protein. A stiffer dough means it's got a higher protein. And so we'll go ahead and cover these so they won't dry out. I'll be back in 30 minutes and we'll test the window panes on these doughs. By testing the window pane, we can see what kind of quality the flour is after only 30 minutes. And then, after an hour, we'll test by pulling another window pane, and we'll see how strong the flour is. You can do this test with any type of flour, and you can also change the hydration rate if you like. I would suggest keeping the hydration level at a percentage that you're comfortable with, and then using that for every batch of flour that you test. That way you get a feel for the flour and you get an idea of what the quality should be like.